December 21, 1944. Outside Bütgenbach, on the northern shoulder of the Ardennes, German assault troops moved forward in the belief that artillery still obeyed the old rules. First came the ranging shots, then the correction, then the real bombardment. A disciplined soldier could survive that sequence. He could hear the first shells, judge the pattern, and throw himself down before the full weight of steel arrived. By that winter, veterans of both fronts believed they understood that rhythm. What they did not understand was that the Americans had found a way to remove it. Ahead of the German advance, men of the U.S. 26th Infantry Regiment held frozen positions on ground that mattered far beyond a single village. The roads behind them led west. If the German attack broke through there, the northern sector of the Bulge would open wider. The balance on paper favored the attackers. The 12th SS Panzer Division had experience, armor, and momentum. Many of the Americans in the line were cold, exhausted, and in some cases newly arrived replacements. Yet hidden behind those foxholes was something more decisive than another reserve battalion. It was a system. That system did not rely on a miracle gun, a secret shell, or some experimental machine. It relied on timing, fire control, radios, maps, and the ability to make dozens of separated artillery pieces behave like one weapon. Within minutes, shells fired from guns scattered across miles of Belgian countryside could be arranged to arrive together on one narrow patch of ground, not one after another. Together. The effect was simple and brutal. The few seconds that once gave men a chance to survive were gone. That was what made the moment so dangerous. The Germans were not walking into unknown firepower. They were walking into familiar firepower used in an unfamiliar way. The distinction mattered. Armies had long known how to mass artillery. They had not mastered how to make time itself part of the strike. On that frozen morning, mathematics was about to alter the battlefield more completely than most of the men involved could yet understand. To see why the Americans had reached that point, the story has to move backward, away from the Bulge, away from Belgium, and back to an earlier war where artillery was already king, but still not yet perfect. In the First World War, artillery became the dominant killer on the battlefield. That is one of the central facts of industrial war. On the Western Front, great offensives were announced not by cavalry or maneuver, but by bombardment. Villages vanished. Trenches collapsed. Whole sectors were churned into mud and timber and broken bodies. At Verdun, at the Somme, and across the long front from the Channel to Switzerland, guns inflicted casualties on a scale that machine guns later overshadowed in public memory. But artillery, for all its destructive power, carried a weakness hidden inside its own method. It gave warning. That warning did not need to be long. A few seconds were often enough. The first rounds landing short or wide told experienced troops what was coming. Men learned to hear incoming shells, sense direction, read spacing, and move fast. They pressed into dugouts, shell holes, communication trenches, or any shallow crease in the earth. Those seconds did not make bombardment harmless. Far from it, but they increased the odds of survival just enough to preserve defenders who could emerge when the barrage lifted. Again and again in the Great War, attacking armies discovered that even immense shelling did not always erase resistance. It stunned, it disorganized, it killed in terrible numbers, yet it often failed to eliminate the surviving core of a defense. That lesson shaped doctrine in the years after 1918. Artillery remained feared, but it was also understood. Armies studied volume, caliber, and preparation fires. They improved survey work and communications, but the deeper assumption remained largely unchanged. Bombardment had a rhythm. A soldier might hate it, but he could learn to live through it if he had warning, cover, and discipline. Survival depended on that brief interval between first impact and full concentration. What no major army had fully solved was how to erase that interval, how to strike with mass but without the familiar build-up, how to deny troops the instinctive moment in which they saved themselves. In the 1920s and early 1930s, while many militaries were cutting budgets and trying to forget trench warfare, a small group of American artillery officers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, asked exactly that question. They were not searching for louder guns. They were searching for a better method, and that search would quietly produce one of the most consequential battlefield systems of the war to come. It began far from combat. Not in France, not in Belgium, and not under enemy fire, but in classrooms, plotting rooms, and artillery exercises on the plains of Oklahoma. At the U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Officers in the late 1920s and early 1930s were trying to solve a problem that earlier armies had accepted as unavoidable. If artillery was to be decisive in fast-moving modern war, it had to become faster, more flexible, and more centrally controlled. Most of all, it had to stop behaving like a collection of separate batteries and start behaving like a single instrument. Major Carlos Brewer was one of the key figures in that effort. He pressed for a new method of must-fire that reduced the slow, piecemeal process of adjusting each battery individually onto a target. His successor, Major Orlando Ward, carried those ideas further. Between 1932 and 1934, Ward and other instructors refined what became the Fire Direction Center, a centralized method for receiving target information, calculating firing data, and coordinating multiple batteries through one command process. It was an administrative and technical solution, but its battlefield consequences were enormous. The principle was elegant. If accurate maps, survey points, weather data, firing tables, and communications were brought together at battalion level, one control center could calculate firing solutions for several batteries at once. That meant speed. It meant concentration. It meant one observer's call could produce not a scattered response, but a coordinated strike from many guns. The system required discipline and standardization. Every battery had to trust a central solution. Every observer had to work from the same map grid logic. Radios had to function. Survey data had to be reliable. Gunners had to believe in a process that reduced individual improvisation in favor of collective precision. The concept did not sweep the army overnight. There was resistance, as there often is when doctrine changes faster than institutional habit. But by 1941, demonstrations helped convince senior leadership that the American artillery arm had found something genuinely new. The United States entered the war with a fire control method more responsive than many of its rivals and more adaptable to the fluid conditions of modern combined arms combat. It still looked ordinary from the outside. No dramatic machine, no revolutionary barrel, just improved thinking. But once American gunners learned to use that thinking under battlefield pressure, separated guns could be timed, concentrated, and directed with a speed that turned calculation into shot. By 1944, that quiet revolution was ready to prove itself under the worst possible conditions. The brilliance of the American artillery system lay in how unremarkable its parts seemed when viewed alone. A forward observer at the front, a battalion fire direction center, a map coordinate, a corrected watch, a set of firing tables, a radio net. None of those items by itself promised a revolution. Together, they created one of the most responsive and feared artillery methods of the Second World War. The process began with observation. A forward observer, often close to the infantry line and in direct view of enemy movements, identified a target and transmitted its location. That message went to the Fire Direction Center, the battalion's calculating brain. There, trained personnel converted coordinates into firing data, azimuth, elevation, fuze setting, charge, and the timing needed for each participating battery. Because the center knew where each battery was positioned and how long each shell would take to travel to the target, it could do something older artillery systems struggled to achieve under combat pressure. It could instruct different batteries to fire at different moments so that shells launched from different distances still landed nearly together. That was the essence of time on target. It was not merely heavy artillery fire, it was synchronized artillery fire. The target did not receive warning in stages. It received impact in concentration. The wider American doctrine reinforced that advantage. Radios were pushed down to lower levels. Survey and mapping standards were improved. Batteries were trained to respond to centralized fire missions regardless of which frontline unit requested support. The system could also shift fire quickly, which mattered on fluid battlefields where attacks developed in minutes, not hours. In many armies, artillery support remained highly effective, but slower, more tied to pre-arranged plans, or more dependent on deliberate preparation. The American method cut response time and increased flexibility in ways infantry immediately understood. If they were hit, the guns could answer fast. By 1944, this had become more than technical efficiency. It had become confidence for American troops and uncertainty for their enemies. The knowledge that support could arrive rapidly changed how infantry held exposed ground. It also changed how attackers calculated risk. A movement that seemed safe one minute could be struck the next by fire from guns no one near the target could see. In the Ardennes, where winter, terrain, and surprise all favored the German offensive, that hidden system would be tested under extreme pressure. There on Elsenborn Ridge and near Bütgenbach, one brain would command many guns, and the result would not be theoretical for long. Before dawn, the ground south and east of Bütgenbach was already under pressure. The Battle of the Bulge had begun on December 16, 1944, when Hitler launched a last great offensive through the Ardennes in an attempt to divide the Western Allies, seize Antwerp, and force a political rupture in the coalition against Germany. In the northern sector, one of the key objectives was the Elsenborn Ridge area, where roads and high ground made local American resistance strategically significant. If those positions gave way, the consequences could extend far beyond one stretch of Belgian countryside. In that sector, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, including the 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry Regiment, occupied positions that Americans came to call the Hot Corner. The name fit. The men there were exposed to sustained pressure from one of the strongest parts of the German assault. Opposing them were elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division and other attacking formations supported by armor, artillery, and the momentum of the opening breakthrough. Some American units in the area contained veterans hardened by Normandy and the Hürtgen Forest. Others included replacements with far less experience. What bound them together was necessity. They had to hold. The terrain helped, but only if it was supported. Snow, ridges, fields, and narrow approaches could slow an attacker, yet terrain alone could not stop a determined assault backed by tanks and infantry. What transformed the defense was the artillery net behind it. Around Elsenborn Ridge, American fire control gained access to a remarkable concentration: 348 guns from 23 battalions. That number mattered not simply because it was large, but because those guns were not firing as isolated units. They were linked through the very system developed years earlier at Fort Sill. That changed the nature of the battlefield. A foxhole on the front line was no longer just a point defended by the riflemen inside it. It was a node connected to observers, radio operators, plotting rooms, and gun crews spread across miles. Every likely German avenue of approach could be covered by a timed response. Every attack risked entering a zone already measured, registered, and waiting. So when German forces moved again in the darkness of December 20 and 21, the Americans were not merely bracing for impact. They were preparing to answer with a coordinated blow the attackers would not expect until it was already too late. Then the system revealed its full meaning. As German infantry and armored elements advanced toward the American line near Bütgenbach, the response did not unfold with the familiar tempo of older artillery fire. There was no leisurely build-up, no first loose pattern to announce what was coming. Observers identified the target area, fire direction centers calculated, batteries positioned at different distances received their firing times. The shells were launched in sequence, but the men under them did not experience a sequence. They experienced arrival. That distinction was everything. Eyewitnesses described the effect as a sudden detonation across the target zone, as though the battlefield had erupted in one violent instant. A concentration of shells landed within the same narrow window, often described in terms of mere seconds. That meant men caught in the open received not warning but impact. The instinct that had preserved generations of soldiers under artillery, the reflex to flatten, run, or dive at the first rounds was cut away. There were no useful first rounds. There was only the strike itself. This was why time on target was so feared. It did not make artillery fundamentally more explosive. It made artillery more immediate. Casualty-producing power was compressed into the opening instant, the point at which troops were most exposed. Later artillery doctrine would preserve the same principle because the battlefield truth behind it was plain. The first seconds of a shelling are often the deadliest. Once men get down, dispersion and cover begin to work in their favor. Time on target aimed precisely at the moment before that could happen. At Bütgenbach, the effect was not abstract. It helped break repeated German efforts to close with the American infantry. Assault formations trying to exploit darkness, weather, and surprise were instead caught under tightly coordinated concentrations. The attackers had seen heavy artillery before, including the immense bombardments of the Eastern Front. But this felt different because the mind could not process it in the old way. It was not the gradual recognition of danger. It was the instant realization that danger had already arrived. The result was tactical and psychological at once. Formations were disrupted. Momentum was broken. Confidence in familiar survival habits collapsed. The ridge held, and as if synchronized impact were not enough, another American innovation was arriving at the same time, one that would make every shell even more dangerous in the fraction of a second before it reached the ground. The shell no longer had to hit the earth to kill. That was the significance of the proximity fuze, one of the most important technical innovations to reach the battlefield in the final year of the war. Developed by American and British scientists, the fuze contained a miniature radio device that sensed when the shell approached the ground and triggered detonation in the air. Instead of burying into mud or exploding on impact at ground level, the round burst above the target. That changed the geometry of fragmentation and the odds of survival for anyone below. For months, Allied commanders had been cautious about using the fuze over land in Europe. The concern was that an unexploded shell might be recovered and its technology studied by the Germans. But the crisis of the Ardennes changed that calculation. The German offensive was too dangerous, too deep, and too close to success in certain sectors for the Allies to withhold an advantage that could save ground and lives. Once the fuze was released for ground combat, American artillery gained not just a more responsive timing system, but a deadlier terminal effect. The difference on the battlefield was immediate. Conventional artillery could still be devastating, but ground bursts often drove a large portion of fragments outward or upward depending on soil, angle, and detonation conditions. Men hugging the ground or crouched in shallow foxholes sometimes survived. Airburst rounds attacked that instinct directly. Fragments descended from above into positions that would once have offered partial protection. Troops in the open suffered even more. The old calculations of safety became less reliable with every burst. Combined with time on target, the effect was multiplied. Coordinated shells arriving almost together were already designed to hit before troops could react. Now those shells could also burst above them at the most lethal height. Timing and fuze function reinforced each other. One denied warning. The other denied many of the protections soldiers still hoped might save them. By early 1945, American gunners had therefore assembled a battlefield method of exceptional effectiveness: centralized fire control, rapid response, synchronized impact, and airburst lethality. This was not a single invention but a system layered through doctrine, training, and technology. In the Ardennes, it had helped stop the German offensive in critical sectors. In the final advance into Germany, it would support not defense under pressure, but the deliberate destruction of the Reich's remaining western barrier. By the spring of 1945, what had been proven under emergency conditions in the Ardennes was ready for final offensive application. Germany's western frontier was shrinking toward the Rhine, the last great natural barrier before the industrial heartland beyond. Allied commanders understood that crossing it would require more than courage and engineering. It would require overwhelming coordination. In late March, during the operations around Wesel and the Lower Rhine, that coordination reached a scale that reflected years of artillery evolution. The battle was no longer about whether the American system works, it was about what happened when that system was applied with full confidence. Here the elements developed since Fort Sill all converged. Forward observers, fire direction centers, dense ammunition stocks, standardized procedures, radios that connected infantry lead to artillery action with extraordinary speed. In support of major crossings and offensive operations, artillery concentrations created the kind of battlefield pressure that dissolved organized resistance before assault troops even reached certain objectives. What had once saved thin American lines on Elsenborn Ridge now helped clear the way into Germany itself. By then, American artillery had earned a reputation that went beyond casualty figures. It gave infantry assurance that they were rarely alone for long. It shortened the emotional distance between danger and support. It also shaped enemy behavior. Troops who believed movement would draw sudden fire moved less boldly. Units already worn by retreat and bombardment became more vulnerable to collapse when artillery arrived quickly and in mass. The psychological effect was as real as the physical one. That is why the story that began outside Bütgenbach matters beyond a single morning in December 1944. The Germans approaching American lines that day thought they understood artillery because every army of the age relied on it. They did not yet understand what happened when a battlefield system learned to take away warning. The American advantage was not only in the number of guns or even in the amount of ammunition available, though both mattered greatly. It was in how those guns were organized, timed, and brought to bear. From the Ardennes to the Rhine, that method helped define the last phase of the war in the West. Somewhere beneath the statistics, under all the maps and reports, the central human fact remains simple. A soldier in danger measures survival in seconds. At Bütgenbach, the Americans learned how to erase those seconds, and once they did, the shape of the battle changed with them.